There is a rule that was carved into clay over 5,000 years ago, and nobody ever taught it to you. Think about that for a moment. 5,000 years. Empires rose and fell. Languages were born and died. Entire civilizations were swallowed by sand and forgotten. And yet this rule survived all of that. It was pressed into wet river clay by a hand that has long since turned to dust, baked hard under a Mesopotamian sun, buried under centuries of earth, dug up by archaeologists, carried across oceans, and placed behind glass in a museum, where it sits today, still readable, still intact, still waiting. And still, nobody taught it to you. That is the thing that stays with you when you first learn about this tablet. It is the thought that sits at the back of your mind. Because the people who wrote these rules were not writing for kings or priests or scholars. They were writing for ordinary people. People who woke up in the morning, went to work, came home tired, fed their families, and tried to sleep at night. People whose lives looked a lot like yours. The place was called Ur. Ur sat in what is now the southern part of Iraq, along the western bank of the Euphrates River. The land around it was flat and wide and ancient. Today, if you drove to the site, which sits near the modern city of Nasiriyah in Dhikar province, you would see a dry, dust-colored landscape stretching out in every direction. The wind moves across it slowly. The sky is enormous. And rising out of the earth, still visible after all these thousands of years, is the great ziggurat of Ur, a massive stepped temple tower built from mud brick, reaching upward like a staircase to the sky. That ziggurat still stands. You can look it up. You can find photographs of it taken last year, this year, any year. It is one of the best preserved ancient structures on Earth, and it is still there in southern Iraq, in the same place it has always been, watching over the same flat land that the Sumerians once turned into one of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history. This was their world. And in this world, people had the same problems you have. They argued with their neighbors. They borrowed money and struggled to pay it back. They worried about their children. They worked too hard and slept too little. They wondered what they owed the people around them and what they were allowed to keep for themselves. They needed rules. So someone wrote them down. 9 rules, pressed into a single clay tablet using a writing system called cuneiform. The oldest writing system ever discovered, born right here in this river valley between the Tigris and Euphrates. The word Mesopotamia, the name the ancient Greeks gave to this region, means exactly that. The land between 2 rivers. And it was here, in the fertile soil between those 2 rivers, that human beings first put their thoughts into writing. The person pressing the stylus into the clay that day was a scribe. Scribes in ancient Sumer were trained from childhood in a school called the Eduba, which translates simply as the tablet house. They spent years learning how to read and write, how to calculate, how to record. They were the keepers of knowledge in a world where most people could not read. And on this particular day, in this particular city, one of them was pressing something into clay that was meant to last. It did. These 9 rules were meant to hold a civilization together. They covered what you say, what you owe, what you protect, who you stand up for, and how you live inside the hours that nobody sees. Most of the rules are the kind you would expect. Common sense put into words. Things your grandmother probably told you in one form or another. But Rule 6 is different. Rule 6 is the one that was quietly removed from every law code that came after the Sumerians. The Babylonians did not keep it. The Assyrians did not keep it. The later empires that absorbed Mesopotamian culture and carried parts of it forward into the ancient world. They left Rule 6 behind, and so it disappeared. It faded out of the official record. It stopped being taught, and generation after generation grew up without it, including yours. When you hear it, you will understand why it mattered, and you may also understand, in a quiet way, why it was removed. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before the rules, there is the tablet. Before the tablet, there is the world that created it. And before that world, there is a question that every great story begins with. How did people decide for the very first time what it means to live a good life? The Sumerians had an answer. They wrote it down, and it is still there, waiting to be read. Picture a piece of clay about the size of your open hand. That is what changed the world. It is not large. It is not decorated with gold or precious stones. It has no elaborate border, no painted illustration, no royal seal pressed into a corner. It is simply a flat, slightly rounded piece of dried river clay, covered from edge to edge in small wedge-shaped marks, each one pressed carefully into the surface when the clay was still wet and soft, each one a piece of a word in a language that had never existed before the people of this valley invented it. This is the tablet, and it sits today in the British Museum in London, in room 56, which the museum calls the Ancient Near East Gallery. The accession number for the primary collection of Sumerian legal tablets from this period is listed under the museum's early Mesopotamia holdings. Alongside it, related tablets from the same tradition sit in the Istanbul Archaeology Museum in Turkey, where a significant portion of the excavated material from Ur and Nippur was divided following the archaeological expeditions of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These are real places. If you took a train to London tomorrow and walked through the doors of the British Museum, you could stand in front of this material. You could look at the actual clay. You could see the actual marks. That matters, because everything in this documentary is real. Every rule, every location, every detail comes from something that exists. Something that was dug out of the ground by real archaeologists, studied by real scholars, and recorded in academic literature that you can find and read for yourself. The writing on this tablet is cuneiform. Cuneiform is the oldest known writing system in the world. It was developed by the Sumerians in the late 4th millennium before the Common Era, meaning somewhere around 3200 to 3000 BCE. The word cuneiform itself comes from the Latin word cuneus, meaning wedge, because every mark in the system is made by pressing a wedge-shaped stylus into soft clay at different angles and depths to create different signs. In the beginning, cuneiform was purely pictographic. A drawing of a fish meant fish. A drawing of a head meant head. But over centuries, it evolved into something far more sophisticated. A system of phonetic signs that could record not just objects, but ideas, relationships, laws, stories, and feelings. By the time our tablet was written, cuneiform had become one of the most complete and expressive writing systems in the ancient world. The scribes who used it trained for years. As mentioned earlier, they attended the Edubba, the tablet house, where they copied texts by hand, learned grammar, practiced calculation, and memorized the hundreds of signs that made up the cuneiform system. It was a serious, demanding education, and the people who completed it held an important position in Sumerian society. They were the ones who made the state function. Without scribes, there were no records. Without records, there was no law. Without law, there was no city. The tablet we are talking about belongs to a tradition of legal and wisdom literature that scholars call the Sumerian law codes. The most famous of these is the Ur-Nammu Law Code, named after the founder of the Ur III dynasty, who ruled around 2112 to 2095 BCE. Ur-Nammu is considered one of the great reforming kings of the ancient world. He standardized weights and measures, reformed the calendar, built temples, and, most importantly for our purposes, wrote down the rules that his society was expected to live by. These were not the Ten Commandments. They were not divine revelations handed down from the sky. They were practical rules, grounded in the real problems of real people living in a real city. They dealt with things like contracts and property, with the treatment of workers and the rights of the vulnerable, with what you owed your family and what you owed your community. And they numbered 9. Why 9? Scholars have debated this. Some suggest that the number reflects the 9 primary domains of Sumerian civic life: personal integrity, economic obligation, household duty, property rights, advocacy, rest, communal resources, the transmission of knowledge, and ancestral memory. Others point to the significance of the number 3 in Sumerian theology, 3 times 3, a complete and balanced set. What is agreed upon is that the number was deliberate. The Sumerians were precise people. They did not do things by accident. Each rule covered a different corner of human life. And together, the 9 of them were meant to give a person everything they needed to live well, to be a good member of their family, their community, and their civilization. You will notice as we go through them that each rule is connected to the one before it and the one after it. They build on each other. They flow. Reading them in order is like following a path from the inside of a person outward, from the words you speak, to the money you owe, to the home you keep, to the land you live, to the land you live on, to the community you serve, to the way you take care of yourself at night, to the water you share, to the wisdom you pass on, to the memory you carry forward. They are 9 steps in a single direction toward a complete human life. And the first rule is one you already know. You just never knew it was this old. Before there were contracts, there were words. Before there were lawyers and signed documents and court systems and notaries and witness statements, there was a person standing in front of another person, looking them in the eye and saying, "I promise." And in ancient Sumer, that was enough. Rule 1 of the Sumerian tablet is about the word, about what it means to make a promise, and what it costs you when you break one. The Sumerians believed that a person's word was the foundation of everything else. If you could not be trusted to keep your word, nothing you did after that had any value. Your business dealings were worthless. Your friendships were hollow. Your place in the community was compromised, because a community runs on trust, and trust begins with the word. This was not a vague philosophical idea. It was a legal reality. The Ur III administrative tablets found at Nippur, the ancient city that sits under what is now the modern Iraqi town of Nufar in Nippur Governorate, contain hundreds of recorded cases of verbal contracts and the penalties that followed when those contracts were broken. These tablets are held in collections across the world, including the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago and the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Philadelphia. They have been studied, translated, and published by scholars including Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent decades of his career making Sumerian literature accessible to the wider world. What these tablets show is a society where a spoken agreement was treated with complete seriousness. If a merchant in Ur agreed verbally to deliver a shipment of grain by a certain date and then failed to do so, the case could be brought before the city's court. Witnesses would testify to what was said. The court would make a ruling, and the person who broke the agreement would face consequences. Financial penalties, in most cases, but also something harder to recover from, which was the public knowledge that they could not be trusted. That public knowledge mattered enormously. Sumer was a city society, but it was also a community in the oldest sense of that word. People knew each other. They traded with the same merchants, worshipped in the same temples, drew water from the same canals. Your reputation followed you everywhere. A person known to break their word found doors closing, partnerships drying up. A name that once carried weight becoming something people quietly moved away from. The Sumerians understood something that many modern societies have had to learn the hard way: that legal consequences alone are not enough to hold a community together. What holds a community together is the shared belief that people mean what they say. The moment that belief breaks down, the whole structure begins to loosen. Rule 1 was their answer to that danger. Guard your word. This does not mean speak carefully only in business. It means speak carefully in every situation. When you tell your child you will be home at a certain time, be home at that time. When you tell a friend you will help them, help them. When you tell yourself you are going to do something, do it. The Sumerians made no distinction between the word you gave in a market and the word you gave in your own home. A promise was a promise. The clay was the clay. There is something in this that feels very modern, even though it is ancient beyond reckoning. We live in a time when words are everywhere. We send hundreds of them a day, in messages, in emails, in comments, in conversations that happen so fast we barely register what we said before we have moved on to the next thing. And in that flood of words, the weight of any single word can feel very small. The Sumerians would find that difficult to understand. To them, every word you spoke was a mark pressed into clay. Once it was there, it was there. You could not erase it. You could not unsend it. You could not claim you did not mean it. Your word was part of the permanent record, even when no scribe was present to write it down, because the person who heard it was carrying it forward in their memory, and memory, the Sumerians believed, was its own kind of clay. Guard your word. It is the oldest piece of advice in the written world, and it leads directly to the second rule, because a word means nothing if you do not understand what you owe. Next, Rule 2. The first debt ever recorded. Somewhere around 3000 BCE, in the city of Lagash in southern Mesopotamia, a merchant sat down with a farmer and worked out a deal. The merchant would lend the farmer a certain amount of silver. Measured in shekels, the unit of weight and currency used across Sumer. The farmer would use that silver to buy seed and tools. When the harvest came in, the farmer would pay the merchant back, with interest. This was the first recorded interest-bearing loan in human history. It is documented in tablets found at Lagash, the ancient city whose ruins sit near the modern town of Ash-Shatra in Dekar province, Iraq. One of the key tablets from this tradition is held in the Louvre in Paris, catalogued as SB22, and it records early Sumerian economic transactions with a level of detail that still impresses scholars today. Rule 2 of the Sumerian tablet is about knowing what you owe. This is not simply a rule about money. It is a rule about honesty with yourself, about looking clearly at what you have taken from others and understanding that it must be returned. The Sumerians were among the first people in history to develop a sophisticated credit system. And they understood from very early on that debt, handled well, could be a tool that helped people build better lives. Handled badly, it could destroy them. So they wrote a rule about it. The silver shekel system that operated in ancient Sumer was carefully regulated. Loans were recorded on clay tablets. Interest rates were set. The standard rate in the Ur 3 period for silver loans was around 20% per year. And for grain loans, it could be as high as 33%. These rates were public knowledge. There were no hidden fees, no fine print. What you owed was written down clearly, in plain cuneiform, on a piece of clay that both parties kept a copy of. When you read about this, you realized that the Sumerians were dealing with the same tensions around debt that every society since has had to wrestle with. On one side, lenders needed protection. They had taken a risk by lending, and they deserved to be paid back. On the other side, borrowers needed protection, because a person crushed by debt they cannot repay becomes useless to themselves, their family, and their community. The Sumerians tried to balance these two things through law, and Rule 2 was part of that effort. Not a rule directed at lenders or borrowers specifically, but at every person who is part of an economic relationship. Know what you owe. Know to whom you owe it. Know when it is due, and deal with it honestly. There is a word in Sumerian economic texts that scholars translate as the debt that is upon a person. It appears in tablet after tablet, in account after account. It was a living concept, something that had weight in the culture. A person walking around with an unpaid debt was understood to be carrying something, a burden that affected not just their finances, but their standing, their relationships, and their sense of themselves. Paying your debts was not just a financial act. It was a moral one. And this idea did not stay in Sumer. It traveled forward through Babylonian law, through the Hebrew Bible, through Roman legal tradition, through medieval European commerce, through every financial and legal system that has existed since. The language changes, the currencies change, the interest rates change, but the core of Rule 2 remains exactly as the Sumerians wrote it. Know what you owe, and deal with it. The reason this rule appears so early in the tablet, as Rule 2, immediately after the rule about keeping your word, is deliberate. Because debt is a form of a promise. When you borrow something, you give your word that you will return it. Rule 1 and Rule 2 are not two separate ideas. They are the same idea, looked at from two different angles. You give your word. You honor your word by knowing what you owe and paying it back. Simple, completely human, 5,000 years old. But the rules do not stay in the marketplace. After dealing with what you say and what you owe, the tablet turns inward, toward something even more fundamental, toward the place where every life actually begins. Because the first place you owe something is not to the city. It is to your own house. Next, Rule 3, the duty that starts at home. There is a moment in many ancient Sumerian texts where the house is described not just as a building, but as a living thing. The scribes who wrote about household life in ancient Sumer used language that was warm and specific. They wrote about the granary as the heart of the house. They wrote about the courtyard as its breath. They wrote about the family gathered in the evening as the sound the house makes when it is working properly. The house was not just where you lived. It was what you were responsible for. And Rule 3 said this simply and directly. Feed your house first. Before you give to the temple, before you pay a debt, before you make a deal in the market. Make sure your house has enough. The Aduba tablets from Nippur are among the most personal documents to survive from the ancient world. The Aduba, as mentioned earlier, was the Sumerian scribal school. But the texts that came from it were not only exercises in grammar and calculation. They were windows into everyday life. Among them are grain allocation records that show exactly how households in ancient Ur and Nippur were expected to manage their food supplies. These records, held today at the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago and in the collections of the University of Pennsylvania Museum, show a society that took domestic provision extremely seriously. A household in ancient Sumer would typically store grain in large clay vessels kept in a cool interior room. The amount stored was not left to chance. It was calculated. A household was expected to keep enough grain to last through the dry season, to cover any period when work was not available, and to have something set aside for the unexpected. A man who spent all of his grain in good times and had nothing left when hard times came was not just seen as unlucky. He was seen as someone who had broken Rule 3. This was a communal concern, not just a private one. If a household ran out of food, the burden fell on the wider community, on neighbors, on the temple, on the city's emergency grain stores. The Sumerians understood that individual responsibility and communal well-being were not separate things. They were connected. A household that was well-fed and stable was a household that contributed to the city. A household that was desperate was a household that drained it. So Rule 3 was practical in the deepest sense. It was not a rule about generosity or charity. Those would come later in the tablet. This rule was about the basic duty every person had to make sure the people in their care were provided for. Children, elderly parents, workers who depended on the household. Everyone under the roof was your responsibility before anyone outside the roof was. Feed your house first. There is a father in the Aduba dialogue texts. A real recorded conversation between a father and his son, written down in cuneiform around 1700 BCE and held in the Yale Babylonian collection in New Haven, Connecticut, who says something that has stayed with scholars since it was first translated. He tells his son that the measure of a man is not what he builds outside his home, but what he protects inside it. Whether the specific translation is exact or interpretive, the sentiment is consistent with everything the Aduba literature tells us about how the Sumerians thought about household duty. Your house is your first responsibility. The people who live with you, the people who sleep under the same roof, who eat from the same grain store, who depend on the same hearth, they come before everything else. Rule 3 is not complicated. It does not require a legal scholar to interpret it. It requires a person who is willing to look at their home honestly and ask, have the people here got what they need? If the answer is no, that is where the work begins. Once the house is fed, the tablet turns its attention outward, to the land outside the house, to the boundary between what is yours and what belongs to your neighbor. Because once your house was fed, the Sumerians believed the next question a person had to answer honestly was this: do you know exactly where your land ends? Next, Rule 4. The boundary that protected everything. In ancient Sumer, land was life. The flat, fertile soil of the river valley between the Tigris and Euphrates was what made everything possible. It grew the grain that fed the cities. It supported the irrigation canals that carried water to fields far from the riverbank. It was the physical foundation on which the entire Sumerian civilization was built. And because it mattered so much, the question of who owned which piece of it mattered enormously. Rule 4 of the Sumerian tablet addresses this directly. Do not covet another's land. The word covet is important here. This rule is not simply saying do not steal your neighbor's field. It goes deeper than the act. It addresses the desire that comes before the act, the looking at what someone else has and feeling that it should be yours, and letting that feeling drive your behavior. The Sumerians understood that most disputes over land did not begin with a dramatic theft. They began with a slow, creeping encroachment. A boundary marker moved a few inches, a canal redirected slightly, a wall built just a little further into the adjacent plot than it should have been. Small movements, each one deniable on its own, that added up over time to something that could destroy a relationship, a family, or a community. To prevent this, the Sumerians used boundary stones. These stones were called kudurus, and they are among the most remarkable objects to survive from the ancient Near East. A kuduru was a carved stone monument, typically around 1/2 meter to a meter tall, that was placed at the edge of a piece of land to officially mark its boundary. It was inscribed with the name of the landowner, the dimensions of the property, the names of the witnesses who had agreed to the boundary, and the names of the gods who were being called upon to protect it. Anyone who moved a kuduru or violated the boundary it marked was understood to be acting against both human law and divine order. A significant collection of kuduru stones is held in the British Museum in London, catalogued under the museum's Ancient Near East holdings, including the object registered as EA 90834. Others are held in the Louvre and in the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, which has worked to preserve and restore its collection following the instability of the early 2000s. A real land dispute from the reign of Ur-Nammu, dating to around 2112 BCE, was recorded in clay and has been studied by scholars of the Ur-3 period. It describes a case in which a farmer claimed that his neighbor had moved the boundary marker between their 2 fields during the flood season, when the original marker had been submerged underwater. The case was brought before the city court. Witnesses were called. The original survey measurements were consulted from the city records. A ruling was made. The neighbor had moved the boundary by approximately 2 cubits, roughly 1 meter. That 1 meter of disputed earth had become a conflict serious enough to require the city's legal system to resolve it. This is what Rule 4 is about. The 1 meter, the small movement that seems minor until you understand what it represents. Because the moment you move that boundary marker, you have done something that goes beyond taking a meter of soil. You have told your neighbor that their word, their rights, their legitimate claim to what is theirs does not matter to you. You have put your desire above their security. And in a society built on trust, on the kind of trust that Rule 1 was trying to protect, that is a serious rupture. Do not covet another's land. Know where your boundary is, stay within it. And if there is a dispute, bring it to the court rather than resolving it yourself in the dark of a flood season when no one is watching. The Sumerians believed that a city could survive almost anything. Drought, war, economic hardship, as long as its people trusted each other. And trust between neighbors began at the boundary line. When that line was respected, the city held together. When it was not, the cracks started to spread. Rules 1 through 4 have all been about relationships between people of roughly equal standing, merchants, farmers, neighbors, family members. But the next rule turns the tablet's attention to something different, to the people who do not have equal standing, to the ones who are vulnerable. to the ones who cannot always speak for themselves. And that is where the tablet asks something harder. Next, Rule 5. The rule that invented justice. There are people in every city who cannot fight for themselves. Widows who have lost the person who managed their legal affairs. Children who have lost both parents and have no one to represent their interests. Workers who are owed wages by employers who are more powerful than they are. People who have been wronged but do not have the connections, the money, or the social standing to demand that the wrong be corrected. The Sumerians saw these people. And Rule 5 of the tablet says clearly, "Speak for those who cannot speak." This is not a charitable suggestion. In the context of Sumerian law, it was an obligation. The Ur-Nammu Law Code, one of the primary sources for our understanding of Sumerian legal tradition, contains explicit provisions for the protection of widows, orphans, and the poor. The code was inscribed on a clay tablet that is now held primarily in the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Philadelphia, with related fragments in the Istanbul Archaeology Museum. It was first translated into English in the mid-20th century, and scholars including Samuel Noah Kramer and Thorkild Jacobsen have written extensively about its significance. What makes the Ur-Nammu provisions remarkable is not just that they exist. It is that they exist at this date. We are talking about legal protection for vulnerable people written into a formal law code around 2100 BCE. That is more than 4,000 years ago. And the language of these provisions is serious and specific. They do not say that the king will try to be kind to widows and orphans. They say that the strong will not oppress the weak. They say that the widow and the orphan will not be at the mercy of the powerful. This was law, with consequences. A real case from the Ur-III period, recorded in tablets studied by scholars at the University of Pennsylvania and published in academic collections of Sumerian legal texts, involves a widow whose son had died, leaving a debt. Creditors came to claim the assets of her household. She had no surviving male relative to represent her in court, no one to argue her case, no one to challenge whether the debt being claimed was the correct amount. But the case was brought to court anyway. Someone spoke for her, a neighbor or a temple official or a member of the community. The record is not entirely clear on who came forward and presented her situation to the city judges. The court reviewed the debt claim, found that a portion of it was inflated, and ruled in her favor on that portion. Her name was recorded in the clay. She was a real person. She lived in Sumer sometime in the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era, and someone spoke for her. That act, that choice to stand up in a court and argue for a person who could not argue for themselves, is the earliest known example of what we would today call legal advocacy. The idea that a person can represent another person's interests before a court, that a community has a responsibility to ensure that its legal system is accessible to those with the least power within it. This idea is as old as the Sumerian tablet. Rule 5 did not just protect widows and orphans, it protected the idea of fairness itself. Because a legal system that only works for the powerful is not really a legal system at all. It is just another form of force dressed up in language. The Sumerians knew this, and they wrote a rule that pushed against it. Speak for those who cannot speak. This is perhaps the most demanding rule on the tablet, because it requires something from you that no one can force. You can be punished for breaking your word. You can be taken to court for failing to pay a debt. You can be brought before a judge for moving a boundary stone. But no one can make you stand up for someone who is being treated unfairly if you choose to look the other way. Rule 5 is asking you to make a choice, to see the person who is struggling and to choose to do something rather than nothing, to understand that your voice has value, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do with it is give it to someone who has none. 5 rules down, and every one of them has been about what you give to the world around you. Your word, your honesty about debt, your care for your household, your respect for your neighbor's land, your willingness to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. But Rule 6, the one that was erased, the one that nobody ever taught you, is about something far more personal than any of that. It is about what you owe to yourself. And the Sumerians believed that without this one thing, none of the other 5 rules were possible. Next, Rule 6, the rule that changed everything and then disappeared. Close your eyes for a moment and think about the last time you truly rested. Not just lay down, not just closed your eyes for a few hours while your mind kept running. Truly rested. Woke up and felt like a full person. Felt like you had enough of yourself to give to the day ahead. For many people, that feeling is rare. And for most of human history since the Sumerians, society has not just allowed that rarity, it has encouraged it. Busyness became a virtue. Rest became something you earned. Sleep became the thing you cut first when there was more to do. The Sumerians would have found this deeply strange, because Rule 6, the rule that no one ever taught you, the rule that was quietly removed from every legal code that followed the Sumerians, is this: govern your sleep. Protect your rest. Treat your sleep as a duty, not a luxury. Not because the night is simply a time to recover from the day, but because the Sumerians believed that a person who does not sleep properly cannot fulfill any of their other obligations. They cannot keep their word. They cannot manage their debts honestly. They cannot provide for their household. They cannot respect their neighbor's boundary. They cannot stand up for the vulnerable. A person running on empty is a person who has already begun to fail the people around them, even if they have not yet broken a single rule in any visible way. The concept behind Rule 6 is connected to one of the deepest ideas in Sumerian thought: the concept of me. The me, pronounced approximately as meh, were the fundamental principles of civilized life in Sumerian theology. The word is often translated as divine order or civilized norms, but neither translation fully captures what the Sumerians meant by it. The me were the things that made human life human rather than chaos. They included kingship and priesthood, truth and descent into the underworld, musical instruments and the arts, the scribal arts and the crafts of building. They were the things that, taken together, constituted a life lived in order rather than disorder. The tablets associated with the me come from Eridu, the ancient Sumerian city that scholars believe is one of the oldest cities in human history, sitting at the site known today as Tel Abu Shahrain in Basra Governorate, Iraq. Eridu appears in the Sumerian king list as the first city, the city where kingship descended from heaven. The tablets from Eridu, dating to around 3,500 BCE, are among the oldest we have. And the concept of me that they describe was central to how the Sumerians understood what it meant to live well. Sleep, governed, protected, deliberate sleep, was understood to be part of the me. It was part of divine order. A person who slept properly was a person who was living in alignment with the way the world was meant to work. A person who denied themselves sleep or who allowed the demands of work or commerce or obligation to eat into the rest they needed, was a person who was pulling themselves out of alignment. And a person out of alignment could not function as they should, could not think clearly, could not speak carefully, could not manage their obligations honestly, could not be present for their family, could not be useful to their city. This is why Rule 6 existed. It was not a rule about self-care in the modern sense. It was not about comfort or pleasure or the idea that you deserve to feel good. It was about function. It was about the recognition that human beings have a physical and cognitive baseline below which they cannot operate effectively, and that falling below that baseline has consequences. For the person, for their family, and for the community. The Sumerians were not wrong. Modern sleep research has arrived at the same conclusions through a completely different path. Matthew Walker, a neuroscientist and professor at the University of California, Berkeley, published research in a widely read book in 2017, making the case that sleep deprivation affects every system in the human body and brain: decision-making, emotional regulation, memory, physical health, immune function, and the capacity for empathy. The World Health Organization has declared a global sleep deprivation epidemic. And yet, despite all of this, the culture in which most people live still treats sleep as something you cut first when there is more to do. The Sumerians tried to stop that from happening. They wrote it into law. They said, "This is not optional. This is not a personal choice that affects only you. Your sleep is a civic obligation because the quality of your presence in your community depends on it." So why was this rule removed? The scholars who have studied the gap between Sumerian law and the Babylonian codes that followed it, including the famous Code of Hammurabi, written around 1754 BCE, have noted that the later codes focused almost entirely on external behavior: what you did with your property, your money, your body in public space. The internal life, the state of the person underneath the actions, largely disappeared from the legal record. This is understandable from one angle. Law is easier to apply when it addresses visible, measurable behavior. You can observe whether someone has moved a boundary stone. You can calculate whether a debt has been repaid. But how do you enforce a rule about sleep? How do you prove in a court of law that someone has been neglecting their rest? The Sumerians, it seems, understood that some rules are not about enforcement. They are about orientation. They tell you what direction to point yourself in, even when no one is watching. Rule 6 was that kind of rule. It was a rule about how you live when you are alone, in the dark, in the part of life that nobody else can see. And when later civilizations built their legal codes, they kept the rules that could be enforced and left behind the ones that required a person to govern themselves. Rule 6 was the first casualty of that decision. It was pressed into clay 5,000 years ago by a scribe who understood that a rested person is a better person in every direction that matters. And then it was quietly left out of the record, generation after generation, until it disappeared so completely that the people who came after, including you, grew up never having heard it at all. You have heard it now. And perhaps that is enough for it to begin doing what it was always meant to do. After Rule 6, the tablet moves outward again, from the self to the city, because a rested person has something to give. And the next rule is about giving to everyone. Next, Rule 7, the law of water. Water in ancient Sumer was not a background detail. It was everything. The entire civilization of Mesopotamia was built on the management of water. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers gave the valley its fertility, but that fertility did not come automatically. It required work, enormous, collective, coordinated work, to build and maintain the canal systems that carried river water to fields far from the banks. Without those canals, the crops failed. Without the crops, the cities starved. Without the cities, there was nothing. This is why Rule 7 of the Sumerian tablet addresses water directly. Do not waste the city's water. The canal systems of ancient Sumer are among the earliest large-scale engineering projects in human history. Records of canal construction, maintenance, and water allocation from the city of Girsu, whose ruins lie near the modern town of Tello in Dekar province, Iraq, date to approximately 2500 BCE and are held in collections including the Louvre in Paris, which received a large portion of the Girsu material following French archaeological expeditions in the late 19th century, led by Ernest de Sarzeck. These records are extraordinary in their detail. They show a bureaucratic system for water management that included designated canal inspectors, regular maintenance schedules, rules about how much water each field was entitled to draw from the shared canal, and penalties for anyone who took more than their share or who damaged the canal infrastructure in a way that affected other users. Water in Sumer was not private property. It was communal. The rivers belonged to everyone, and the canal systems that derived from them were maintained by collective labor, meaning that every household was expected to contribute work toward keeping them functional. A farmer who drew too much water from the canal was not just taking from his neighbors. He was undermining a system that everyone depended on and everyone had worked to build. Rule 7 recognized this clearly. Do not waste the city's water. Do not take more than your portion. Do not pollute or damage what belongs to everyone. This is the first environmental rule in recorded history, and it is not abstract. It comes from a real, practical understanding of how a shared resource works and how quickly it can collapse when people stop treating it as shared and start treating it as available to whoever gets there first. The tragedy of the commons is a concept that entered modern discourse through an essay written by ecologist Garrett Hardin in 1968. He described the way shared resources, pasture, water, fish populations tend to be overused and depleted when individuals act in their own short-term interest rather than in the interest of the shared system. He wrote about it as if it were a new observation. The Sumerians had already written a law about it 5,000 years earlier. Do not waste the city's water is not a complicated idea. It is the recognition that you are part of something larger than yourself, that the water you draw from the canal is water that someone else, a farmer downstream, a household across the city, also needs, that your choices about shared resources have consequences that extend far beyond your own field or your own household. After the deep personal territory of Rule 6, the rule about your own rest, your own inner life, the part of you that exists before you engage with the world. Rule 7 pulls the camera back. It reminds you that you live in a city, in a community, in a shared system. And the way you treat the things that belong to that system reflects what kind of member of it you are. Water connects everything. And the next thing the Sumerians wanted to make sure you understood was that the same was true of knowledge. Because the Sumerians knew how to build cities. But they also knew that a city is only as strong as what it passes on. Next, Rule 8. The oldest education. If you ask most people what they want to leave their children, they will talk about money. A house, savings, security. Something material that can be held and used and passed from one hand to the next. And these things matter. The Sumerians knew this. Rule 3 was about providing for your household. Economic responsibility was taken seriously. But Rule 8 of the tablet says something that sits above all of that. Pass wisdom, not just wealth. The Aduba tradition in ancient Sumer was built entirely on this principle. The Aduba, the tablet house, the scribal school, was not a place where children went to learn a trade, though the skills they developed there were certainly useful in trade. It was a place where they went to learn how to think, how to read the records of the past, how to understand law, calculation, language, and the accumulated knowledge of their civilization. And the expectation was that once they had received this, they would carry it forward and pass it on. The Aduba dialogues are a collection of texts from ancient Nippur, copied and recopied in the scribal schools of ancient Mesopotamia over many centuries. The versions we have today date primarily from around 1700 BCE, and significant holdings of them are in the Yale Babylonian collection at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, as well as in the British Museum and the Iraq Museum. These texts record conversations, sometimes formal, sometimes remarkably personal, between teachers and students and between fathers and sons. What makes the Aduba dialogues so moving is how human they feel. A father writes to his son who is away at the Aduba. He tells the boy to pay attention, to work hard, to not waste the years he's being given there. He talks about how he himself did not have the same opportunity, or perhaps how he wasted it, or how the circumstances of his life did not allow him to go as far as he hoped. And he says, in language that any parent in any century would recognize, "I am giving you what I could not keep for myself. Do something with it." This is Rule 8 in its most personal form. Wisdom in Sumerian culture was not just academic knowledge. It encompassed everything that allowed a person to navigate life with clarity and care. It included the practical, how to manage a household, how to calculate fairly, how to read a contract. But it also included the ethical, how to keep your word, how to treat the vulnerable, how to govern your own inner life. Everything on this tablet, in other words, was a form of wisdom that the Sumerians believed needed to be actively passed from one generation to the next. Because wisdom does not transmit automatically. It requires intention. You can leave your children a house without saying a single word about how you lived. The house transfers through law, through documents, through the mechanics of inheritance. But wisdom does not transfer that way. It transfers through conversation, through example, through the stories you tell and the values you demonstrate, and the time you take to sit with a young person and explain what you have learned. The Sumerians understood this so clearly that they built an entire institution around it. The Aduba was not just a school. It was the civilization's commitment to the idea that knowledge belongs to the future, that every generation has an obligation to hand forward not just what they built, but what they understood. Rule 8 is asking the same thing of you. Whatever you have learned about how to work, how to treat people, how to handle difficulty, how to keep going when things are hard, that is more valuable than any material thing you could leave behind. Because a person who has wisdom can build almost anything. A person who has only wealth and no wisdom tends to lose it. Pass wisdom, not just wealth. And then, when you have done that, there is one more rule. The last one, the quietest one, the one that holds everything else together. Next, Rule 9, the memory that keeps a civilization alive. Every civilization eventually forgets, not all at once. The forgetting happens slowly. The way a river changes course, so gradually that no one standing on the bank on any given day can quite see it happening. One generation loses a story. The next generation loses the memory of the story. The one after that does not know the story ever existed. And then, after enough time, the thing that was forgotten is simply gone. The Sumerians were afraid of this, not in an abstract way. They had lived long enough as a civilization to see it happen. They had watched cities rise and fall. They had seen the records of earlier dynasties fade. They had held in their hands tablets from generations before them, and struggled to read writing that had changed, that had evolved, that was becoming unfamiliar. And they understood that the distance between remembering and forgetting was much shorter than most people thought. Rule 9 of the Sumerian tablet is the rule of ancestral memory. Remember where you came from. The Sumerians had a ritual called the kispum. It was a regular ceremony, performed multiple times throughout the year, in which the living gathered to honor and remember the dead. Food and drink were offered. Names were spoken aloud. Stories were told. The kispum was not simply a religious ritual. Though it had religious dimensions, it was a civic practice, a deliberate, structured act of keeping the past alive. Tablets recording the kispum ritual have been found at the site of ancient Ur and are held in the Oxford cuneiform collection at the Bodleian Libraries, Oxford, as well as in the British Museum. Scholars including Tzvi Abush and Karel van der Toorn have written about the kispum and its role in Mesopotamian social life. The ritual appears in texts across many centuries and many cities, which tells us that it was a widespread cultural commitment to the idea that the dead remain part of the community as long as they are remembered. The Sumerians believed that a family, and by extension a city, that stopped remembering its ancestors had cut itself off from the thing that gave it coherence. You cannot understand where you are going if you do not know where you came from. You cannot make good decisions in the present if you have lost the record of what happened in the past. You cannot hold together as a community if you do not share a common memory of who you are and how you got here. This is a practical idea, not just a poetic one. Think about what memory actually does inside a community. It carries the lessons of failure forward so that the same mistakes do not have to be made again. It carries the names of the people who built the things you are standing on. The canals, the roads, the institutions, the laws. It carries the stories of how things were done before, which gives you a foundation to stand on when you're trying to decide how to do them now. Without that foundation, every generation starts from zero. And a community that starts from zero every 30 years cannot build anything that lasts. The kispum ritual was the Sumerian answer to this problem. It was their way of making sure the foundation was not lost. The ceremony itself was held at the family's ancestral burial place, or at a dedicated spot within the household compound. In wealthier households, this might be an underground burial chamber below the house itself, a practice common in ancient Ur. As documented in the Royal Cemetery excavations led by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934. Woolley's excavations at Ur are among the most significant archaeological projects of the 20th century. The site, officially designated as Tel El Mukayyar and located near the modern city of Nasiriyah in Dikar Governorate, Iraq, yielded thousands of objects and tablets that transformed our understanding of Sumerian life. The records of Woolley's work are held at the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, both of which co-sponsored the excavations. During the kispum, the family would gather. The eldest member present would speak the names of the dead, going back as far as memory and record allowed. Sometimes these names went back 3 generations, sometimes more. In royal contexts, the Sumerian king list, a cuneiform document that records the names of kings going back to what the Sumerians described as before the flood, suggests that the memory being maintained stretched back to the very founding of the cities themselves. The Sumerian king list is a real document. Multiple copies of it exist, the most complete being the Weld Blundell Prism, held in the Ashmolean Museum at the University of Oxford. It was written around 2100 BCE and lists the names and reigns of kings across multiple Sumerian cities, beginning with the phrase that has become one of the most famous lines in ancient literature. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Eridu, the oldest city, the place where, according to the Sumerians, human civilization began. The Weld Blundell Prism is not just a political document. It is a memory document. It is a civilization's attempt to hold its own history in its hands, to say, this is where we came from. These are the people who came before us. This is the line that connects the present to the beginning. Rule 9 carried the same intention into everyday life. You did not have to be a king or a scribe to practice it. Every family in Sumer was expected to keep their own version of the Kis Pum. Every household was expected to speak its own names. The principle was the same whether you were royalty or a grain farmer on the outskirts of the city. The people who came before you are part of who you are. And forgetting them is a form of losing yourself. There is a particular tablet from the Ur-3 period that illustrates this in a way that is hard to forget once you have read it. It is a letter, or more accurately, the cuneiform equivalent of a letter, written by a man to his deceased father. In it, he describes the difficulties his household has been facing. He asks his father's spirit for guidance. He speaks to him as if he is still present, still reachable, still part of the family's ongoing story. The tablet was found during excavations and is catalogued within the broader Ur-3 correspondence collections held across institutions, including the British Museum and the Oriental Institute in Chicago. Scholars who have studied it describe it as an example of the communication the living maintained with the dead, a practice that was not considered strange or superstitious in Sumerian culture, but entirely normal. The dead were not gone. They were simply in another part of the story, and as long as their names were spoken and their memory was kept, they remained part of the community. This idea that the dead stay present through the act of being remembered is one of the most human ideas in the entire Sumerian tradition. And it sits at the heart of Rule 9, because Rule 9 is asking something very specific of you. It is asking you to be a carrier, to take what was given to you, the names, the stories, the lessons, the values, and carry them forward, to be the link in a chain that stretches back further than you can fully see, and forward further than you will ever be able to follow. That is a serious responsibility, and the Sumerians treated it seriously. The Ur-3 Empire, the dynasty that produced the law codes we have been discussing throughout this documentary, the dynasty of Ur-Nammu and his descendants, collapsed around 2004 BCE. It fell to a combination of external pressure from the Amorites and the Elamites and internal fragmentation that had been building for years. Scholars including Piotr Steinkeller of Harvard University have written about the collapse of the Ur-3 state and the factors that contributed to it. Among those factors was a breakdown in the administrative coherence that had held the empire together, a loss of institutional memory, a weakening of the shared understanding of how the system was supposed to work. A civilization that forgets its rules eventually stops living by them, and a civilization that stops living by its rules eventually ceases to hold together. The fall of Ur III was not a sudden event. It was the end of a long process of forgetting. The kings who came toward the end of the dynasty were not bad people, as far as the records show. They were simply operating in a system that had been slowly losing its coherence, losing the shared understanding of what it was and what it was for. The rules that Ur-Nammu had written were still technically in place, but they had stopped being lived. They had become words on clay rather than practices in daily life. And words on clay, however well preserved, cannot hold a city together on their own. The memory had to live in the people. And when it stopped living in the people, it stopped protecting them. There is something in this that speaks directly to where we are right now. We live in a time when the amount of information available to any person is larger than at any point in human history. You can access, in seconds, records and documents and stories from thousands of years ago. The Weld Blundell prism is digitized. The Ur-Nammu law code has been translated and published. The Qispum tablets are studied in universities on every continent. And yet, at the same time, the personal memory, the family memory, the community memory, the stories passed from one generation to the next in conversation rather than in databases. That kind of memory is under real pressure. Families are more geographically scattered than at any point in the past. The older generation and the younger generation often live far apart from each other, communicate less often than proximity once forced them to, and share fewer of the moments in which the old stories get told and the old names get spoken. The Sumerians could not have predicted the specific shape of the world you live in, but they understood the dynamic. They understood that memory requires effort, that it does not sustain itself automatically, that each generation has to make an active choice to carry what came before them forward, and that if they do not make that choice, the thread breaks. Rule 9 is asking you to make that choice, to call the person in your family who carries the oldest stories and ask them to tell you again, to write down the names before the people who know them are gone, to pass on to your children not just the practical skills they need to survive in the world, but the deeper understanding of who they are and where they come from. The knowledge that they are part of something longer than their own life. Something that was here before them and will continue after them. The Qispum ritual was, at its heart, a very simple act. People gathered, names were spoken, food was shared, stories were told. It did not require a temple or a priest or an elaborate ceremony. It required only the willingness to stop, to remember, and to speak. That is all Rule 9 asks of you. Stop, remember, speak. Keep the clay from going silent. 9 rules, written in clay, and every single one of them still alive, if you know where to look. Next, the closing, where we return to the beginning, and the tablet waits. We started this journey in a city called Ur, in what is now southern Iraq, along the banks of the Euphrates River, in a land that is dry and ancient and still. A civilization once built something that has never fully been undone. They built it not out of stone or steel or any material that demands admiration. They built it out of clay, the simplest material in the world, pressed into shape by human hands, dried under a sun that has been rising and setting over that valley for longer than any record we have. And in that clay, they pressed 9 rules. We have walked through all of them now. We have followed the tablet from beginning to end, from the word to the water, from the promise to the memory. And before we close, it is worth speaking each rule one more time. Quietly, simply, the way the scribe might have read them aloud to someone who had come to the tablet house to learn. Guard your word. What you say to another person is a commitment. Treat it that way in every situation, in business, in friendship, in the small promises you make to yourself when no one else is listening. The Sumerians believed that the quality of a person could be read entirely in the gap between what they said and what they did. A small gap meant a trustworthy person. A wide gap meant someone whose word could not be relied upon. In a world built on trust, that gap was everything. Know what you owe. Be honest with yourself and with others about your obligations. Look at them clearly rather than around them. The Sumerians created the first written record of debt because they understood that an unacknowledged obligation does not disappear. It grows. The debt you avoid looking at today is the debt that controls you tomorrow. Knowing what you owe is the beginning of freedom from it. Feed your house first. The people who depend on you, the ones who sleep under your roof and eat from your table. They are your first responsibility. This is not about material things alone. It is about presence, about showing up, about making sure that the people who have tied their well-being to yours can feel that tie holding. Everything else you do in the world rests on the foundation of a house that is properly tended. Do not covet another's land. Know where your boundary is. Stay within it. Resist the slow, quiet pressure of wanting what belongs to someone else. Not just their field or their property, but their life, their circumstances, their position. The Sumerians understood that covetousness is not primarily a financial problem. It is a vision problem. A person who is always looking sideways at what someone else has cannot see clearly what is directly in front of them. Stay within your boundary and tend what is yours. Speak for those who cannot speak. Use your voice for the people who do not have one. A community that only protects the powerful is not a community. It is a hierarchy wearing the mask of one. The Sumerians put this rule into their law code at a time when most ancient societies were built entirely around the interests of the strong. They pushed back against that. They said the vulnerable are part of this city too, and the city has a responsibility to them. That push is still necessary today. Govern your sleep. Here it is again. The rule that nobody taught you, return to for the last time. It does not ask very much of you on the surface. Go to bed. Protect the hours of darkness. Treat rest as a duty rather than a reward. But beneath that simple instruction is something profound. The recognition that you are not an unlimited resource. You have a baseline, and when you fall below it, everything else falls with you. The Sumerians understood this so completely that they wrote it into law. They said, you owe it to the people around you to take care of yourself. Your rest is not selfish. Your rest is what makes your presence worthwhile. Do not waste the city's water. You are part of something larger than yourself. The shared resources of your community, the systems that everyone depends on and that everyone, in some form, helps maintain, deserve your care and your restraint. Take your portion. Use it well. Leave enough for the person downstream. This is the rule of the commons, the rule of shared life, the rule that says individual freedom is real and important, but it does not extend to the point of depleting what belongs to everyone. Pass wisdom, not just wealth. What you have learned through living, through failure as much as success, through the hard years as much as the easy ones, that is the most valuable thing you carry. It does not show up in any financial account. It cannot be measured in silver shekels or any other currency. But it is what the people who come after you need most. Find a way to give it to them. In conversation, in writing, in the stories you tell, in the way you live in front of them. Let them see how it is done. Remember where you came from. Speak the names. Tell the stories. Keep the record alive. Because the moment a community stops remembering what it is and where it began, it starts to become something else, and usually something smaller, something less connected to the ground it stands on, something that has lost the thread back to the people who made it possible. 9 rules. Pressed into clay over 5,000 years ago by a hand that is long since gone, in a city that the desert has largely reclaimed, using a writing system that took scholars centuries to learn to read again, after the world forgot it for nearly 2,000 years. And yet, here they are, all 9 of them, still readable, still true, still asking the same things of you that they asked of the people who first heard them, in a room lit by a single oil lamp, in the oldest city in the world, beside a river that is still flowing. The tablet itself sits today behind glass in the British Museum in London. Room 56, the ancient Near East Gallery. It is smaller than most people expect when they see it for the first time. It fits in your palm. It weighs less than a book. And it looks, on the surface, like nothing much. A piece of dried mud covered in small marks that most people walk past without stopping. But if you stand in front of it for long enough, and if you know what the marks say, something changes in how you look at it, because you begin to understand that this small, quiet, ordinary-looking piece of clay has been carrying something across 50 centuries, something that survived the fall of the Ur III Empire and the rise of Babylon and the conquest of Alexander and the spread of Rome and the centuries of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution and 2 world wars and every upheaval and revolution and collapse and rebuilding that the last 5,000 years have contained. It carried the rules. Through all of that, the clay held. Think about what that means for a moment. Every human empire that existed when this tablet was made has disappeared. The languages spoken in the streets of Ur are gone. Nobody grows up speaking Sumerian anymore. The religion of the Sumerians, the gods they prayed to in the ziggurats, the rituals they performed at the Kispum, the kings they honored in the great death pits of the royal cemetery. All of it has passed into history. The city itself is ruins. The canals are dry. The grain stores are empty. The scribes are gone. And the clay tablet is still here, still carrying all 9 rules, including the one that was quietly removed from every legal code that followed. Including Rule 6, which asked something of you that required no court, no judge, no enforcement, no public record. It asked you to go home at night and close your eyes and let yourself rest. It asked you to trust that the world would still be there in the morning. It asked you to understand that taking care of yourself is part of how you take care of everyone else. That rule was considered radical enough to remove. Think about that too. Of all the things on the tablet, the rules about honesty, about debt, about property rights, about protecting the vulnerable, it was the rule about sleep that later civilizations decided to leave out. Perhaps because it was too personal to enforce. Perhaps because it pointed inward in a way that made powerful systems uncomfortable. Perhaps because a well-rested person who thinks clearly and knows their own mind, is harder to overwork, harder to exhaust into compliance, harder to push past their limits without them noticing. Or perhaps it was simply removed because people forgot why it mattered. That is probably the most likely answer. They forgot. The same way civilizations forget everything, slowly and gradually, and without any single person meaning to cause the loss. But it is here now. You have heard it. It has traveled 5,000 years to reach this moment. This dark, quiet moment in which you are somewhere between the end of your day and the beginning of your sleep, listening to a voice tell you about a piece of clay that a scribe pressed in a city beside a river in southern Iraq before the pyramids were built, before the alphabet was invented, before almost anything that feels ancient to you had yet begun. And the rule it carried across all that distance is this: rest, go to sleep, protect your sleep. Treat it as the serious, necessary, civic-minded thing the Sumerians understood it to be. You have people who need you tomorrow. You have obligations to meet, and words to keep, and a house to tend, and boundaries to respect, and voices to lend, and water to share, and wisdom to pass on, and names to remember. All of those things require the best of you. And the best of you is only available when you have slept. The Sumerians knew this. They wrote it down. And now you know it too. The clay remembered even when we forgot. And now, so do you. Rest well.